So I recently attended CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington, D.C., arguably the largest and most important conservative political event of the year, every year. And while I found it to be overwhelmingly a neoconapalooza, as I expected and was warned it would be, it was still a fascinating experience from a people-watching standpoint, and oh, my dear friends, I am, and always have been, an avid people watcher. It's why I went into communication, it's why I went into studying social science, because I very much enjoy watching what other people do. Oftentimes we hear that conservatives are criticized for being homogenous, and while that's certainly true that some people on the more conservative side of the political spectrum do desire greater homogeneity, at least in the United States, one thing I found to be quite interesting to note was the vast and wide variety of both political views and both social and physical identities that were being expressed, all under the umbrella of conservatism at this one single conference. It's funny, again, everyone says that conservatives are all old white guys for the most part, right? Or I guess young white guys trying to shoot up schools, I suppose. But I found all kinds of people at this conference, and it was just really interesting to note. And regardless of the organization's own goals being seemingly influenced mostly by the power of cash, and I suppose I should say that with a grain of salt because I received a media pass and shouldn't say too much negative about it as the organization requested that we don't disparage the goals of the conservative movement. Yeah, it does seem as if there was some financial motivation going on. Moreover, though, it was not so much the speakers and the main events that I was interested at when I went to CPAC. What really interested me were the people. I wanted to observe them more than anything, being that that's the shit that really revs up my engines. I've spoken about it on a few streams, and maybe I'll do another stream myself, but I did talk with Hard Bastard on a few streams live, which will be linked below, that includes some of my reactions and thoughts on the event as it was occurring. However, this video will be about my general thoughts on what I saw as some interesting phenomena occurring within the so-called conservative movement, such as it is presented at CPAC, at least, as it manifests itself there in a way that is physically and empirically observable to someone such as myself. And that is in group identification and optimal group distinctiveness in the face of vast individual differentiation and differences across a single political movement and social identity. What I mean is that I rolled up in this bitch with my purple ass hair and even on the second day, an unfortunate run up one of my stockings, accompanied by a gentleman in a hoodie that reads Hard News Network, and was treated not only with just general congeniality, but with outright expressions of what I would call affect from completely random people in these goddamn halls. Physical appearance aside, though, my politics are wonky as all fuck, and although I'm label averse because I think labels are poor descriptors, and because I'm oft willing to have my mind changed on my politics, I'll say I'm a Hoppian, libertarian, paleo-conservative, monarcho-minarchist. See, this is why labels are dumb, my friends. But that's probably the most simplistic way to describe myself, at least at this current second. Again, that's very willing and open to change. I was there surrounded by a bunch of rhinos and neocon boomers, but also a bunch of Orthodox Israeli Zionist Jews, a bunch of people from the Christian religious right, libertarians and ANCAPs, the ethno-nationalists, the so-called alt-righters, and Identity Europa. I saw all of these people, all of them in the same building, and everyone there. Everyone was being goddamn pleasant to one another. Wowee. That seems just a little bit odd, right? Because, well, there's nothing any of those people have anything to do with each other, except for all falling under the general, again, umbrella of conservatism. Well, I think I have an answer. It's because of how social identity and our simultaneous needs for both group assimilation and distinction operates. Thus today I'm going to discuss in detail one of my favorite topics, which is social identity theory in detail. I've mentioned aspects of this many times before because, well, frankly, when I started working on researching and studying social science at an advanced level, I thought social identity was just kind of interesting. But I came to understand over time that it actually kind of explains almost everything about human interaction. It's as close to a universal theory as we really have. Before I get too heavy into the sciencey stuff, though, essentially, we all have an identity. We understand this, right? A sense of the self. Who am I? This sense of the self, however, is located in the center of an array of social identities. these different parties to which we are members. And I don't just mean political parties, I mean all kinds of parties to which we are members, all kinds of groups to which we associate. We have inherent social identities, such as race or gender, to which we cannot self-select membership. And then, in addition, we have self-categorized social identities. These are the things that we choose to engage in for some reason, such as political affiliation. Although, well, within that particular example, there is some significant evidence that the politics of our parents, our heredity, play a significant role in what we select for ourselves in our politics. It's not determinism, of course, but it is highly correlational. My point is that these groups to which we are members help shape and define our sense of the self. Who am I? And thus to understand the vast differences in people across one seemingly single and isolated social identity, in this case conservatism. We need to get in there. We need to really dig deep and discuss social identity theory. Social identity theory describes and defines the self by internalized membership in multiple social groups. You can see Tajfel and Turner 1986, Turner and Oakes 1986, and of course the seminal Tajfel 1969. Social identity is part of, quote, an individual's self-concept, which derives from his knowledge of his group membership or social group, or social groups, together with the emotional significance attached to that group. That's Tajfel 1974, page 69. Like how we use a bunch of he pronouns? Wow, what a sexist, am I right? In the context of social identity, the sense of the self is derived as a product of membership in various social groups, and in opposition to outgroup membership. Basically, who am I, and who am I not? What groups am I a member of? What groups do I not want to be a member of? Or am I not desiring to be a member of? The social self is constructed as, quote, an emergent group process, where group identity is internalized as part of an individual's entire perception of the sense of the self. See Turner, Oakes, Hassalam, and McGrady, 1994, page 461. What this means is, as I said earlier, the sense of the self exists in this strange little myriad of identities, both self and group identities, group selves. All of the group selves coming together to forming the sense of the self. This is why it is emergent, because it is not always stable. There are periods and times in which certain group identities are more salient or are more important than others. For example, someone who is, a furry, might have their furry identity far more salient when they go to a furry convention than when they're sitting alone at their house and fapping to furry porn. That's just kind of how identity works. When our identities are activated or salient, well, then they're more central to our concept of the self. Who am I? Well, then that person might say, well, I'm a furry. And then it has something to do with their sense of total identity. An individual can possess multiple social identities, though, based on different social groups that he or she perceives one's own membership. From the framework of social identity, the self is a construction based upon various groups in which individuals perceive themselves as members. That is, again, we have, at any point in time, many groups to which we are members. It's just what group is most salient that depends on whether or not we perceive that group as truly important to defining the sense of what makes me me. Social identity situates the self in relation to in-group and out-group members. As social identity defines the self based on group membership, the self is also defined by groups that an individual does not belong to. In other words, out-groups. Again, who am I and who am I not? Given thereby that the self is a collection of group identities, when an individual feels positively about him or herself, they also tend to feel more positively about their in-group. Individuals may tend to perceive also in-group members more favorably than out-group members. We've gone over this many times, and it's really not that surprising now, is it? I tend to like people who are part of my shared in-group because they're part of my shared in-group. We have something in common. And I tend to perceive people who are not part of my in-group less favorably. It doesn't mean I hate them. In fact, that's actually kind of the opposite. It's not so much that we have in-group love and out-group hate, but more that we have just in-group love. We have greater homophily towards people who share groups with us, and therefore we have greater affect toward them. Multiple social identities form the framework for our values, goals, relationships, interactions, and behaviors. See Hassalam 2014. Any particular value, such as loyalty, may be experienced in the concept of similarity to a perceived group. In this case of what I'm talking about, conservatism in general, or in opposition to the perceived external outgroup, in this case again, leftism in general. Values and behaviors that constitute group norms are enmeshed with personal values and behavior, allowing group identification to significantly influence how people act and interact through a process of what's called self-categorization. Basically, these are groups that we choose. They are groups that we do not select for ourselves, such as gender and race. We don't get to pick those, but we get to choose other groups that we're members of, such as political party affiliation. The social self can be further distinguished from the personal self in that the social self is dependent on the environ of interaction. Personal identity is comprised of aspects that make an individual unique and different from other members of any associated group. These are the things that make us weird and different. When one group, though, is highly salient in its availability to one's identity, it may override the personal identity and act in exclusion of the personal identity. See Turner 1984. This is part of the process of self-categorization. Self-categorization leads to depersonalization and self-stereotyping. When self-categorization is activated, in-group similarity and out-group dissimilarity are more salient. Basically, I'm more aware of how similar I am to people who share a same group with me, and how very disparate and different I am from people who do not share that identity. Turner 1984 defined depersonalization further as the, quote, redefinition of the self from unique attributes and individual differences to shared social category memberships and associated stereotypes. See page 528. When an individual is depersonalized through the activated self-categorization, he or she defines the self by beliefs, values, and stereotypes associated with his or her groups, and in opposition to beliefs and stereotypes about perceived outgroups. Basically, we all engage in stereotype thinking. We don't really think about people as individuals. We start to think about them all as they relate to their group membership, rather than the self representing a combination of group social identities and individual identities, as well as social identity. When individuals are self-categorized strongly into a group and depersonalized, social identity overrides personal identity. Through this process, the individual and interpersonal behavior can be transformed into kind of intergroup behavior, with the intricacies of our interpersonal relationships subsumed by concerns for group identification. Behavior enacted by self-categorized and depersonalized individuals often seeks to emulate other members defined through group prototypicality. Prototypicality is the extent to which an individual is perceived as representative of the values, norms, and beliefs of a group in total. Individuals can be members of a social group without feeling as if they represent or actively are representing the stereotypes and beliefs associated with an in-group or in-group norms. By this I mean, when I talk about prototypicality, what do we think about when we think about brownies? Do we think about fedoras? We think about trench coats, that kind of stuff. Those are called prototypical or stereotypical trappings of what makes someone a brony, at least in terms of their physical appearance. However, it's very possible for someone to be a brony and have none of those attributes, nor express any of those attributes. That is a non-prototypical, then, member of the brony social group. And what we find is that in-group members who do not represent the prototypical group member, they may often feel disassociated from their social identities. See Moreland 1985. Basically, if something about you doesn't seem to represent what is the prototypical member, you may feel disconnected from your social group, despite very much being a member of said group. Members who do not feel as if they represent the prototypical norms may desire actually more connection, though, with their social group, and may tend to be sensitive to changes in group norms. See Gardner, Pickett, and Knowles 2004. In other words, if you don't feel like you're a prototypical group member, if there's something about you that's a little bit different, you might be a little bit more sensitive to picking up on just how different you are. Because even within your social group, which should form part of your sense of the self, in this instance, you're kind of an outcast or outlier, right? Self-categorization can be multidimensional, though. in that multiple self-categorizations can be activated simultaneously dependent on the context. An individual can identify with multiple groups at one time, with multiple we identities, in other words. These identities can even be seemingly contradictory or at least conflictory. The relative accessibility of categorization, activation, and depersonalization is dependent on factors of accessibility and fit. Accessibility refers to the readiness to self-categorize based on past experiences, present expectations, current motivation, values, goals, and needs. See Turner and Ornato, 1999. Obviously, at an event that emphasizes membership in a social group such as CPAC, accessibility or salience of group membership is high. The second factor, fit, is defined by comparative and normative fits. See Oakes, 1987. Comparative fit looks at similarities and differences between groups on the basis of comparisons between closeness based on category. Two people may not share multiple social groups, but if they share one, they're comparatively more fit than two individuals who share no social identities, obviously. A binary difference of, let's say, conservative versus liberal would represent comparative fit. Depending on the environmental salience of social groups, say an ethno-nationalist, a white nationalist, and a Zionist Jew, hang on, they actually might have more in common than not. Okay, so an ethno-nationalist and a rhino. Two people generally considered conservative, though, may have no other salient social groups, given their extreme political differences. However, in comparison to a liberal and outgroup member, the social identity of shared conservative values may become more salient in the presence of that person, or in reaction to the outgroup. Normative fit is concerned with category content. This content defines criteria and content that comprises beliefs about a social group. In other words, stereotypes or prototypicality of content associated with group norms. Content includes attitudes about different groups and behaviors associated with certain groups. For instance, Oakes, Turner, and Hassalam, 1991, found that when art students were depicted as hardworking, weird I know, but here's the thing, when they were depicted as hardworking, participants rated an individual art student as less similar to other art students, demonstrating what we've defined here as normative fit. When an art student acted in a way that is believed to be unrepresentative of all art students, aka hardworking, participants believe the art student was a non-typical group member. These associations come from stereotypes about groups and group norms in terms of how we perceive others and how we perceive ourselves and our own place within a group of individuals. While I was not the only person that I saw at CPAC with dyed hair, it would certainly make me fall outside of the normative fit of what we consider normative of conservatives, which is pretty much precisely why I started the habit of doing it, so as to camouflage myself as a liberal. However, to other conservatives, it makes me look like an outlier. As non-prototypical group members, though, we potentially recognize differences between their fit within the group and the fit of prototypical group members. The non-prototypical members may seek to conform to group norms to elucidate group solidarity, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. Potentially, in response to these same motivations, non-prototypical group members are also more likely to express loyalty to the group than prototypical group members because they fear ostracization and outsideness. See Jetton Postmes and McAuliffe, 2002. When non-prototypical group members attempt to conform to perceived group norms, the existence of non-prototypical group aspects only really seem to matter when there is high visibility of non-prototypical group differences. In other words, dyed hair, for example. Group members only tend to be aware of non-prototypical group members' use of in-group messages when the differences are so highly salient that they really can't be excluded as some sort of out-group message. In other words, it's more important and it's more noticeable to find similarity between people that within our own in-group than to find differentiation. However, in terms of wanting to be more or less prototypical of group members, that leads us to optimal group distinctiveness, given that some group members will be more or less similar to the normative fit associated with group norms and will actually actively seek to be more or less similar, because it helps to increase feelings of individuality. According to optimal group distinctiveness, or ODT, as it was defined by Brewer in 1991, of two simultaneous but seemingly at odds needs, the need for assimilation and the need for differentiation from within the group. The need for assimilation is defined as the need for in-group inclusion and belonging, whereas the need for differentiation is defined as the need to be simply different from others, to be unique. The extent to which a group satisfies these competing needs is assumed to depend on its level of, quote, inclusiveness. That is, the number of persons classified as members in that group. Thus, groups that are high in inclusiveness might satisfy a need for assimilation, but will also arouse a need for differentiation. Very tight-knit groups, in other words, will make us feel more connected to others and to this group identity, but depending on other factors, including both those personological and with, as I mentioned, things like group size or identity importance, will also arouse a need to define ourselves as non-identical to our fellow group members. In contrast, groups that are low in inclusiveness satisfy the need for differentiation, but by that same virtue then instigate a need for assimilation. We balance these two disparate needs in any social group to which we are members and achieve equilibrium through identification with social groups at that level of inclusiveness where the degree of satisfaction and the need for assimilation and the need for differentiation is optimal, hence optimal group distinctiveness. From this, the prediction follows that identification should be highest in groups that allow for simultaneous satisfaction of both assimilation and differentiation needs, and that is what I found across many of the different types of people in an event like CPAC. Yes, we all fall under the general social identity of conservatives as a social identity and a sense of holistic sense of the self, but the great diversity in individual differences across all of the people there allows for the optimal distinction across the population, across the populace of saying, yes, I'm a conservative, but I'm also an ethno-nationalist. Yes, I'm a conservative, but I'm also a neocon, I suppose. Particularly in relation to political identification, Abrams' 1993 found that supporters of minority political parties in the UK, at least, were more involved and viewed their parties as more representative of their personal sense of the self, while the majority voters tended to have more in common politically, not only with their parents, but viewed their political affiliation as not deeply descriptive of the sense of the self. This may explain why it's easy to look at an event like CPAC and just visually identify people who might consider themselves to be, for example, alt-right, or people who are Hasidic Jews, based on the physical trappings of their character, things that actually say, this is how I'm choosing to identify myself as a minority group member within my majority group. I mean, I'm not saying I can totally identify somebody's political ideology from their haircut. I'm not Huffington Post labeling certain haircuts as hate symbols or anything. But I think I can see someone who probably considers themselves alt-right, at least at CPAC, when I see them. Maybe not always. Maybe I'm being a little bigoted here. Maybe I'm relying a little bit too much on group participicality. But according to optimal group distinctiveness, there are reasons for which people would want to physically represent themselves as different from the norm to indicate that, yes, we are part of the same general social identity, but I am unique, and this is my optimal distinctiveness, being essentially a minority group within a majority group. This is expressing a certain part of the sense of the self. Additionally, there are two ways in which we differentiate our individual identity from our social identity. Reactive distinctiveness in response to an outgroup threat increases in-group affiliation, including increased behavioral responses. For example, during the time of CPAC, the national media inflamed hate boner for the National Rifle Association, which as of this writing is still in full burn, had just been ignited. And as you may have seen on social media, and as I saw very much in person at CPAC, as the outgroup threat against an icon of our social group, conservatism, prototypicality of conservatism, that being the NRA, was challenged, well, nothing seems to have spurred more donations or lifetime memberships to the NRA than a little threat now does it. In contrast, there is reflective distinctiveness, which occurs in large social groups, such as a massive overarching groups, such as conservatism, that describes all kinds of people of many different types of political ideologies. Anytime a bunch of people get together, though, and organize around any kind of self-categorization, the larger the group of people, the greater the capacity for disagreement and dissent, and difference within the group. However, there are circumstances under which our need for distinctiveness may be less important than our need for cohesion. In order to understand these circumstances, moving beyond just simple description of optimal group distinctiveness, another factor of importance here is that of uncertainty. We don't have many kinds of universal theories in communication or social psychology besides really social identity theory, because frankly, humans are kind of weird and highly inconsistent. But if there is one that at least attempts to approach universality, it's uncertainty, and particularly uncertainty reduction theory or uncertainty management, which posits that we always seek to reduce our uncertainty in communication contexts, or that we seek to manage a desirable level of uncertainty in communication context. You can see Berger and Calabrese 1975 for the seminal. For example, when you meet someone for the first time, provided they seem relatively pleasant or interesting at the outset, or just hot, I guess, we generally want to know more about that person so that we can understand more fully how to react and respond to our interaction with them. If you've come across a fine piece of ass, I would imagine most of my audience, just as a guess here, and I could be wrong, and hey, you can reduce my uncertainty by telling me in essay format in the comments if I am, that one of the first things you would want to know about her before you ask her to dinner is her opinion on feminism. If she starts ranting on about the patriarchy, you probably will get the cue to nope the fresh fuck out, having sufficiently reduced your uncertainty about her crazy status. Of course, you could always just reduce that uncertainty by simply looking out for any aposematic coloration. I mean, unless it's me, though, I guess, because I've got that aposematic coloration. Anyway, in contrast, sometimes they want to actually increase our uncertainty because some piece of information is on some level undesirable. For example, if your girlfriend with whom you have an emotional connection is living with her ex-husband, you might not want to ask too many questions about her sleeping situation. You know, just to avoid the potentially unpleasant informational exposure. I bring this theory up because it illustrates how uncertainty plays a big role in how we communicate and interact with others, and forms the basis for uncertainty identity theory, see Hogg 2007. Generally speaking, though, we don't like to be unsure, be it of our role in an interaction and communication, our beliefs, or, wholly, our place in the universe. But that doesn't necessarily mean we like to be certain in contrast. We just seek to avoid uncertainty. Particularly, we don't like feeling uncertain about ourselves. Most of you are probably aware of the phenomena of cognitive dissonance, which is the feeling of psychological discomfort that arises when an individual's beliefs or behaviors do not align with new information provided. This is because, frankly, that new information creates uncertainty of the validity of our beliefs or behaviors. Thus, to resolve the discomfort created in this instance, the uncertainty must be resolved. While this can be accomplished through careful reflection and consideration of the new information or the new ideas, frankly, such deliberation requires excessive cognitive energy, and as such, it's just kind of a bigger pain in the ass, or in this case, a bigger pain in the head, than merely relying on mental shortcuts, cognitive heuristics, to either dismiss the new information as just false, or to reaffirm previously held beliefs or behaviors. We are cognitive misers for the most part. We want to conserve our cognitive energy. Our brains take up huge amounts of energy, and we don't want to expend it in ways that we find frivolous or unnecessary or uncomfortable. Thus, generally speaking, we don't want to tax our brains more than we ever have to. One way that we deal with uncertainty is to rely on heuristics associated with, you guessed it, our social group identity. As we discussed prototypicality, when faced with uncertainty, we can return to our understanding of these prototypes for answers about confusing scenarios. This refers both to our own groups, to which we self-categorize, and to outgroups through depersonalization of outgroup through stereotyping. We can also use our social identity to reassure ourselves in moments of insecurity when we are challenged in some way. Who am I? I know who I am. I know who I am from the associations I have with others that define me. Therefore, when we feel highly uncertain, it is not surprising that we have greater bias towards our in-group and identify more with our in-group. These effects similarly increase as entitivity increases, that is, the perception of a social group as a unified entity, rather than a collection of mere individuals. In contrast, I've mentioned previously that threats to our group identity can increase intergroup conflict, but that response seems to be mediated on some level by personological differences. Outgroup differences we find when our in-group membership is challenged, such as identified by Spears, Dorsey, and Elmer's 1997, is that we don't always inherently increase our self-stereotyping when threatened, but rather that we tend to do so only when our perception of our in-group is already relatively positive. Further, Given we're looking specifically at optimal group distinctiveness today, it's important to note that, as Badia Jetin Zuzkor and Ashkevis Leherpo 2010 found, that identification with a group identity was greater under threat with small groups than with large groups. Which makes sense based on what we know about small groups providing more opportunity for individuality versus group assimilation, as we discussed above. Thus, small groups with larger group identities involved with them may move towards greater identification under threat. Groups such as in the case of conservatism, the alt-right, for example. What does that mean in this context? Well, a number of things. Rast, Gaffney, Hogg, and Crisp 2012 found that students were more likely to support a non-prototypical leader when they felt uncertain in general. While non-prototypical leaders that did not represent the college culture were lower in general likability, students who felt more uncertainty were considerably more favorable towards the non-prototypical leader than those who did not feel uncertain. Rast, Hogg, and Geisner 2013 examined this further in the context of leader autocracy, and found, similarly, that individuals who reported higher levels of uncertainty also expressed greater liking for an autocratic leader. Just what is an autocratic leader, my friends? Well, the items in the battery include descriptions such as often pushes his or her opinions, makes decisions alone without asking for suggestions, harshly tells subordinates what to do, is bossy and orders subordinates around, and makes sure that his or her own interests are always met. Does it sound like anyone I know? I'm not sure. It's a real toughie. Let me think for a second.
I was wondering what you would say to President Obama.
You're fired.
High uncertainty individuals also expressed greater trust for the autocratic leader and actually perceived the autocratic leader as more prototypical of their group affiliation. In other words, when we're feeling highly uncertain, when we're feeling lost and confused and threatened, we seek out leaders who are more autocratic and who don't particularly give a fuck about the traditional way of doing things, even if they tend to be non-representative of our in-group, because at that point, it doesn't appear to fucking matter. This may provide an explanation for why Trump received such a high approval rating as CPAC. I mean, look at this shit. Despite the event hosting every flavor of conservatives and right-leaning people. Given the highly uncertain future of the United States, particularly during the 2016 election, but continuing going forward as Trump has managed to eke out success as much as he has been able to in completing his campaign promises despite the many blockages from both Democrats and Republicans, it would not surprise me to see a lot of high uncertainty reports from people from all over the political sphere when it comes to politics in the United States. But what these data indicate is that not only does uncertainty increase our feelings of group identity in place of personal identity, but that it also increases our liking and trust in non-prototypical, autocratic authority figures, which fairly perfectly describes Donald J. Trump and his association with the Republican Party, given he has been continually criticized for not being a real Republican.
I started running and people say, "Are you sure he's a conservative?" I think now we've proved that I'm a conservative. Right?
Well, when we're feeling uncertain, it seems that might actually be advantageous for candidates to be, in and of themselves, optimally distinct from the group they represent when that distinctiveness is autocratic in nature. At a last point, however, on how uncertainty affects behavior in group contexts, and while perhaps less explanatory and more potentially cautionary here, is the association between uncertainty and extremism. I want to caution us against some of this shit. That's why I'm bringing it up. Again, though, knowing that we seek our social identifications to cope with feelings of unassuredness, of uncertainty, this is unsurprising, and has been assessed in a variety of contexts, from cults to radical political ideology. There are actually so many, I'm not even sure where to begin, so here's just a list for your perusal should you wish to go at them, which, be my guest. But let's take a look at a few relatively recent examples, and I should point out that citing data from 10 years ago, hey my friends, that's still pretty relevant and recent in the big scheme of things in terms of how publication works. Anyway, Hogg and Edelman 2013 found further support for the importance of not just uncertainty but personal identity in relation to support of violent extremism. Palestinians who reported feeling very close to their Palestinian identity and also reported feeling uncertain about their future were more supportive of violent jihadi tactics against Israelis than those who were not. Prior research had actually also manipulated this relationship beyond just looking at mere correlations in the context of social identity. Hogmehan and Farquharson in 2010 found that students who were exposed to a radical political message identified more with the political group and expressed more desire to engage in behaviors to forward that group's radical goals when they were also more uncertain. As I mentioned in my video on terror management, something we know about conservatives is that we have a tendency toward a need for closure. And while I don't think there has been any direct research on this as far as I can locate or assess, the model fit of need for closure may have something to do with this. May have something to do with uncertainty reduction and group identification. But what we do know is that need for closure has been associated with greater in-group affiliation. Thus, we can postulate that it may be that conservatives are potentially more likely to experience the effects I've all listed above, associated with uncertainty, group identification, extremism, and leadership choice. This would all make sense, based not only on my personal observations at CPAC, but from what we've seen occur over the last year and a half or so, at least in American politics. Despite the fact that individuals who consider themselves conservatives can fall anywhere again, from rhinos and neocons to the religious fundamentalists to libertarians and ANCAPs to alt-right ethno-nationalists, monarchists, fascists, etc. All of us feeling a great deal of uncertainty seem to come together at an event like CPAC, as generally run by neocons as it may be, in support of common goals oriented around non-prototypical autocrats like Donald Trump. What does all of this mean when it comes back to CPAC, though? As we've learned, we seek a certain balance of me versus we in the myriad of groups that we choose to self-categorize and identify with. That is, we seek to maintain a level of distinction and differentiation from others, to maintain our sense of individuality while still feeling as if we are part of the collective while we are assimilated. This is why, even at a conservative convention, for and by conservatives, you see so much diversity of all fucking things across the individual members, not just politically, but even physically. Under the massive umbrella of the term conservative, every member of this group seeks in their own unique way to be unique, be that through mere affiliation with smaller political interest groups such as the alt-right or the Libertarian Party, or through physical delineation like the group of transgender activists I saw carrying a rainbow Gadsden flag around the hallways. Yet at the same time, the fascinating thing about a gathering like CPAC is in the shared group homophily, the shared group love, kind of, weirdly. Despite all of our differences and distinctions, we gathered under the same generic category of conservatism, and that generates more in-group affect than it does out-group distaste under our same social group identification, particularly in terms of uncertainty or threat under which I believe we are currently experiencing. Thus, some weird-looking purple-hair motherfucker such as myself can roll up with media credentials and feel just as welcomed as any ancient neocon in the building. Optimal group distinctiveness. Both me and we. You know, Ronald Reagan once said, "The person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and an ally, not 20% a traitor." And I think that perfectly illustrates the gestalt of what I witnessed at CPAC. That was pretty much what was going on, in terms of the wide variety of individuals gathered under one roof in unified support of a common goal despite their innumerable personal differences. We may highly disagree on methods, but we do tend to have similar values and goals under a shared social identity of conservatism, and although everyone wants to promote their own small subgroup's agenda and intent, it was still extremely polite, pleasant, and congenial. Given what I've described about uncertainty, increase in identification and support for a non-prototypical autocratic leader, this all makes sense too, doesn't it? During his speech at the conference, Nigel Farage said that what Trump did was made conservatives optimistic again.
But I've sensed among some of you in the last couple of days a great sense of optimism. You're optimistic because you know something? This president has made America optimistic once again, and that's a good thing.
And much like that Reagan quote, I think that's an incredibly poignant observation. The general emotional state I observed at the conference was pure, unbridled optimism. Under Obama, many of us felt utterly lost and hopeless, and I know that's for sure why I stayed out of politics outside of general elections, where I wrote in Dr. Paul in 08 and Gary What's Aleppo Johnson in 12. And I know many liberals now feel much the same way. I made an entire video about that. Although, I will say, as Trump similarly said at CPAC, we're helping you, even if you don't know it.
They try like hell. They cannot stand what we've done. But we're doing the right thing. We're even doing the right thing for them. They just don't know it yet. They just don't know it yet.
We're actually looking out for you. And you know, I have come to see that as kind of a major difference between leftists and right-leaning individuals. In that, given our greater concern for purity and authority as conservatives, from a moral foundational perspective, versus the greater preoccupation with care and perceived fairness that liberals tend to have, and this is not a bad thing, this is just a difference that we have. Conservatives have very solidified, objective senses of morality, while leftists tend to have more relative senses of morality. That's not necessarily bad again, it's just different. But I think that's why you can have some fuckface like Lawrence fucking O'Donnell, who surely hates firearms so much precisely because of the hammers.
Stop the hammering. Stop the hammering out there. Who's got a hammer? Where is it?
I don't know. It's on a different
Where's the hammer?
It's on a different
Is it on the, go up on the other floor. Somebody go up there and stop the hammering.
Had the audacity to call Donald Trump a coward for not killing the Vietnamese in a war that I'm sure he has called immoral 1,000 times over, and that he, by the way, also personally draft dodged because his morality is mobile. I'm not saying conservatives aren't capable of being hypocrites. They absolutely are, and are very often. But they do seem to be a little bit more consistent in at least having a general sense of this is what I find moral and I'll stick to it. And hey, maybe I'm wrong. That's just an observation I've made. And maybe, you know, it's just my in-group preference. Despite my own desires to be optimally distant and distinct from rhinos and neocons, the people that I was at CPAC with. I would say, though, at least in my experiences on YouTube, I have also found conservatives to be far more open to converse with me, regardless of how incredibly different our politics may be, than leftists. And I think back to that Reagan quote, just because you're not completely in agreement with me, does not you my enemy make. And although I'm more than welcome and more than willing to talk to leftists about any given topic, I find they're not generally willing to talk to me. I don't know, maybe it's just that outgroup hatred, and I've talked about that in my videos on leftist outrage and hysteria, which is not something that is unique to them. The right is very much capable of that as well. It's just that right now it seems conversation isn't really happening, and honestly, that's unfortunate. I guess beyond me just wanting to cover my CPAC experience a bit, and more importantly, me really wanting to talk your ear off about social science theory, particularly one of my favorite, social identity theory and optimal group distinctiveness, I bring this all up because I am genuinely curious if the same unity in the face of difference is currently present at similar left-leaning events in the way that I noticed it happen at CPAC. Given what we know about our need for closure, potentially increasing in-group identification in the face of uncertainty, that may not be the case. I don't know. However, as I said, I just don't have the data, either quantitative or in a sort of case study examination form such as I observed at CPAC, to make any kind of claim. I would love to attend a left-leaning conference no matter how much the speakers themselves may make me want to blow my fucking brains out, just to observe the social environment and see if it's similar or dissimilar to that of CPAC. Anyway, I just thought this would be a fun topic and some interesting food for thought. Remember, we're all different members of different social groups. And that's all fine. I just hope that we can kind of come to some sort of level of intergroup dialogue. If not, that blows. But oh well, I would at least advocate for it. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.